a great weekend. It's kind of we've got almost everything, almost the flooring put in, almost the entire house, which is really nice. Just have one room left, and it was really fortunate that the timing was the way it was, because like last Sunday we got a call from one of the kids saying, "Oh, by the way, do you remember that you promised that we could stay there on our way to Disneyland and that you'd watch the dogs for an entire week?" And we thought, no, we don't remember that. But it was a good thing that I got that room, the flooring done, because they had a place to stay, which was really nice. And it's a lot better than just staying on the couches in the living room, that's for sure. But that was a lot of fun. I hope you guys had a great weekend, as I mentioned. Um, this this week it's kind of um, bouncing around a little bit, because I felt it would be a good thing to do a review about what the 19th century meant, and then just a really quick, rapid rundown of different kinds of art movements leading up to about 1905, just to give some context. And then we'll talk a little bit about Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, and Fauvism, just touching on them a little. And I think that that is going to be enough to give context to the rest of the term. So and then of course we're going to see my favorite Doctor Who clip, because I mean, we have to. But I wanted to show this with you, and I don't, we'll talk about the 19th century. If you need to, I'd like you to look at the video that I have there, but you don't need to. And contrary to what my kids believe, I was not there. But it is good to have a little bit of background. The 19th century, of course, is really driven a lot by the Industrial Revolution and what that meant to everything from governance to travel technology. Even though colonialism, European colonialism, had been a thing since mid to late Renaissance, and it was really ramped up a lot in the 19th century. And that's where you get the phrase that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because they had control in so many different countries around the world. A lot of stuff was going on just from the economic and governance point of view. One of the sad things, I think, is, and the person who did this video points it out, one of the sad things is, because European countries had so much going on in terms of military technology and rapid transit, that translated to an assumption that might makes right. That's a very ancient concept, that the violent victor was right. But I think with the development of technology, that really helped to support people that perspective. And what is really sad about that, the idea of skin color racism is a relatively new concept. Framing it in that kind of a way, people always look different. We know historically, folks have always known that people look different, but difference was really on the order of, this is my people and everybody else is someone else. They're strangers. We can really see that most of the time. Ancient words in different cultures for members of that society translates to today's word, like human being or people. Like the word for, or the self-identifying word for Navajo, I grew up with 3 Navajo brothers, is Dene, and that means people, human beings, people who think. And that's pretty much the way it has been for an awful long time. And then as North America was being colonized, and you had both slavery and indentured servitude, which was, people from Europe were being bought and sold like cattle as well. With the difference being, at least they had a written contract saying when their debt was paid, they were free. Whether or not it ever translated to that, there was an awful lot going on. And in the 18th century, a lot of these white indentured servants really identified with the black slaves, the African slaves. And so that's when the conversation starts showing up in newspapers at the time, talking about, hinting at what later became white supremacy. That the Ham, Shem, and Japheth somehow had, Noah's son somehow had a relation to black skin and assumed natural state of servitude, and which is really disturbing to me because I thought that's something that was really consistent throughout history, but it's not. It shows up relatively recently in North America and Canada in the 18th century. And with the hyper-industrialization of weapons and transportation technology, that idea of white supremacist colonialism in the 19th century really took off hugely. And so that all leads to the kind of worldview that supports 19th century European art as well, coming into the 20th century. And then in the 20th century, we're dealing with people regaining their identity, and we're dealing with decolonialism and post-colonialism. All those kinds of things. That struggle for identity is something that seems to always couple with self-directed art, but it really becomes energetically, vitally important for the 20th century too. I mean, this is the world that Frida Kahlo was born into, and that's why she was so, she got death threats for doing paintings of herself wearing a men's suit, But all that is just a little bit of the worldview. But with that transportation technology, with the military technology, I think also with all the goods that were being built as a result of the Industrial Revolution, they had to go somewhere, and I think governments had to find somebody to buy them, and I think that was another incentive to colonize places. Just so you have a market to send stuff. But it is interesting that with the birth of photography, the first photo was just out the back window of somebody, and he let the shutter open all day long, and you see just a couple farmhouses and stuff. And that was about the first one that survived is from 1827, but that first photo was taken in 1824. It just deteriorated and fell apart, and finally he got it to survive a couple years later. And it's interesting to me that as soon as the miniaturization of photographic equipment allowed for it, the first thing that happened is that people started doing travel photography, taking advantage of the Industrial Revolution and the new travel technology to go to Egypt and back within a month and a half. I mean, that was unheard of. You can imagine about 1830, an actress got onto one of the first rail lines in Britain and talked about going up to 35 miles an hour and how exhilarating and freeing it was, flying with the birds. I'm thinking that's absurd. I actually came across an article written that if you went faster than 40 miles an hour, you could potentially go back in time. And so people were actually terrified of this. And I think, well, Van, what is the actual speed we need to get to go back in time? I mean, everybody who lived through the 80s should know this. Of course, 88 miles an hour. I mean, obvious. So they weren't even close. But this is also with the Industrial Revolution, we get disposable income, we get artists for the first time being able to actually do stuff because they wanted to, and sharing what they were seeing, except, instead of sharing what everybody expected them to paint. And I think it was Renoir who said that without without metal tubes, of paint, the Impressionists would never have been able to do anything. And by 1899, we get the first film. We get the first real industrialized cameras that could travel around and take a lot of photos pretty much anywhere. We get photojournalism. We get transatlantic cable so people can communicate from Europe to North America and back again. And you can get, yeah.
So don't forget the Civil War photography.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Glass plate, but yeah.
The first time photography was used in a war was in Crimea, but in the Civil War, 20 years later, we get the first real documentary style photographs. I mean, where people, because everybody up until that time, everybody wanted to go to war because then you get a sword, you get medals, you get a bright shiny coat, you could sleep with whoever you wanted. It was just magical, and you get who was Matthew Brody's protege? Was later sent out west to document California. I can't remember his name, but he was the first guy that actually started taking photos of all the bodies in the field and sending those home. And then people started realizing war is not glamorous. Yeah, absolutely. And 1899 also brings about the whole argument between direct and alternating current. Most of the music that we have in the 20th century from really the mid 30s on is based on the C-sharp scale. The C-sharp scale is the audible frequency that's tied into the cycle of alternating current coming through the walls. That's the sound of the alternating current, the 120 volts. So which is just amazing to me that all these things kind of tie together at the same time. And 1895, there was an article, and I think I referenced it in one of the modules, where medical issue. Yeah, I do. In that first section of this module, there was a diagnosed condition called bicycle face. With the invention of the bicycle in the late 1800s, a lot of people supporting the so-called natural order were upset because women were wearing pants and riding bicycles everywhere. And there was this diagnosed condition where women, because of the strain and because of keeping their mouth shut so the bugs didn't fly in their teeth, were gritting their teeth and looking angry all the time. And so they diagnosed it as bicycle face and warned men not to allow their women to, I mean, anybody who's been married knows that this is a really stupid idea, but telling the men not to allow the women to go anywhere. And so I just think it's astounding how much rapid change was going on, and that's the world that we get to. And I think that one of the artists that really bring that out for me is Van Gogh. I mean, he painted from 1890 1905, right around there, and he really captured a lot of the that unsettling feel for a lot of people, the excitement coupled with the unsettling feeling of transitioning from things that have been going on for generations. I mean, this is the first real time where you have generations born and die outside of the feudal system. That was still going on in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, well into the 1800s, and the 20th century sees that release. I mean, yes, it's freedom for some, but it's terrifying for others. But I wanted to share this video with you, and it's probably not going to make it onto the video recording for the class, but I want to share it with you anyway. Let's see.
It makes a huge amount of noise. And this one makes everything go absolutely...
Okay, so this is Vincent van Gogh, because of his bipolar disorder, helped the doctor, Doctor Who, to essentially save the world because he was able to see what the aliens were doing. And to repay him, Doctor Who wanted to bring Vincent van Gogh to see what kind of effect his paintings had. And because at this time in his life, he was getting really depressed. I think that is a really good encapsulation of what he meant for art, but also its perfect transition into the actual 20th century art. Because I think that really talks to the whole fact of that transition period. So I just think it's really amazing. And I love that. Can you imagine how cool that would be if you could bring some of these artists forward and let them see what they did? You know, the impact that they had. I think that would be really amazing. But I wanted to share with you, this is just kind of a rapid fire revisit of some of the artists at the tail end of the 19th century. And I'm thinking more than anything else, I just want to revisit that whole idea of how to look at art that we were talking about, and where the meaning of art resides. We talked about that last week a bit. Does anybody remember what the four tools of artistic critique are, what those four steps are? What's the first one?
Describe.
Excellent. Very good. And what's the second one?
Analyze.
Excellent. Very good. What's the third one?
It's your interpretation.
Right. Interpret. And what's the fourth one?
To evaluate it.
Yes. Excellent. So describe is the what, analyze is the how, interpret is the why, and then evaluate is determining whether it's any good. And and that last one is pretty much entirely opinion, and you know it goes from removing yourself in describe all the way to it's entirely your opinion by the time you get to evaluate. But by thinking about it in an intentional way, it gives vocabulary to our expression, so we can talk about specific things like texture, the use of color, and those kinds of things. And so if you do get a minute, this one right here, excuse me, is only a few short minutes, and it uses a little bit different verbiage, but it talks about how to apply those steps to looking at any art. And then this one I really like. It's only a couple minutes as well, but it talks about where the meaning resides. And I think we did talk about that last week. Where does the meaning of art reside? Is it only with the artist, or is it only with the viewer?
Could be with both, right?
Yeah, I think it has to be with both. Because the artist, of course, has a lot into that, but the viewer has to take part of it in it as well. And part of the meaning is our appreciation of what the artist did, what the culture that they came from, the culture that they lived in, and I think that meaning has to be a collaboration between us and what the artist did, and influenced by our understanding and appreciation for what was going on. Otherwise, we cut out an awful lot of potential understanding, potential appreciation.
And Andrew,
Yeah.
the video you had us watch last week was really interesting because the two theories that were taught in the videos of where interpretation specifically was only done by the artist itself, or it was done by the viewers. And I thought it was really interesting because it can be interpreted in so many different ways depending on who's viewing it and their perception of where they are and how it contributes to their visual information.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, was first written in 1812. And people have tried to compare that to what Shakespeare said when a rose is a rose is a rose, and by any other name, it would, would it smell so sweet? And he's saying something completely different. I don't believe that we can justify the idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It can't be, because if that was true, when we return to something and we thought originally when we first came across it, it looked horrible, when we return to it 10 years later and have a better understanding of what's going on and a broader vocabulary, a lot of the times our minds will change and we'll think it's either not as bad or we enjoy it. If beauty is truly in the eye of the beholder, then there'd be absolutely no frame of reference to be able to return to anything. I think that as we expand our vocabulary, we're able to appreciate more about what the artist does. And our own personal understanding, our own personal perspectives, that relates entirely to how we connect with something. It doesn't change fundamentally the thing itself. And so I know that's a really contemporary concept, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think understanding and appreciation of beauty is definitely in the eye of the beholder. That's entirely our responsibility. If a book talks about nuclear physics and is translated in 4 different languages, if you can't read the book, that doesn't devalue nuclear physics. It just means you don't read that language, and that's it. That's all it means. And so I think Van is completely right. There has to be that kind of conversation between you and your tulpa or your imagination of or understanding of what the artist is doing to derive the meaning. But yeah, definitely. Let's see. Hold on a sec. Where are we going? Is that the one? Yep, that's it. Okay. This right here is just a rapid fire visit of the art history timeline. Just the screenshot, it's not talking about Dadaism, but I wanted to give people kind of an overview of what's going on. Starting from about 1890 forward, Art Nouveau is based really soundly in the Navi tradition of illustrated books or miniature paintings from India, Iran, and the word is Transoxiana. Transoxiana is a term that we like to use when we want to sound smart, and it's just another term for the Middle East leading into Western India. But if you say Transoxiana, doesn't that sound like you're really smart? I mean, it does, doesn't it? But Alphonse Mucha was kind of the master of this Art Nouveau style, which was heavily used in marketing, particularly theater marketing and set design. And very interesting, but that also brings us to Art Deco. And this was both painting, commercial design, but also it was used heavily in architecture. It was used actually when the first automobiles were developed. This Art Deco heavily informed the designs. Arts and crafts kind of surrounded this. This was going on at about the same time as Art Nouveau and Art Deco. And it's still continuing, but you can really see the arts and crafts as it related to Prairie style. Prairie style is traditionally an architectural and stained glass style, furniture style. And there's 2 main kinds. There's the green and green or organic style that was popular in California. And there was the more Tenochtitlan, Mesoamerican inspired style of Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's called Prairie style because it is arts and crafts, early 20th century, but it deals primarily with images from the American prairie. So you get some plant life that was consistent to trees that people thought of when they thought of the Midwest, as well as a lot of the diagonal lines that mimic ryegrass and wisteria that Frank Lloyd Wright felt really encapsulated the Great Plains of North America. And Impressionism kind of bleeds through everything. I like setting up Impressionism as part of this whole process leading into the 20th century, because Impressionism was a demonstration of how people showed how they felt about the world around them, coupled with the new information coming out through just the popularization of photography. which is really important, as well as a burgeoning growing understanding of physics, how light works, optics, all that kind of stuff. Frederick Douglass, who is, everybody should know who Frederick Douglass is, you know, the Captain America of the 19th century. And he was, when he met President Lincoln 3 times. When he first met him, he thought he was an idiot. But by the third meeting, he was really impressed because Abraham Lincoln actually listened and paid it. You know, this was a time when anybody could walk into the White House and if the president was free, they talked to you, you know. And Frederick Douglass said that photography was the single most amazing miracle of technology because it allowed absolutely anybody to present themselves to the world in the same way that was used to only be reserved for head of state, but in the way that you wanted to be immortalized. You had control over your own immortal reference, which I thought was really incredible.
They actually have one of the famous photos of Lincoln has his head superimposed on a different body to make him look more noble.
That does not surprise me. And then it also leads in, you know, the spiritualist church at the time really took advantage of photographic technology to make photograph collages and develop what was called spirit photography, where you could see the ghosts in the photography. And that's important in relation to Abraham Lincoln because Mary Todd was a huge supporter of it. And there's a famous photo of the ghost of Lincoln with his hands on her shoulder. And that really validated what became, you know, special effects photography. But, you know, we get from Impressionism into Post-Impressionism, and a lot of these terms, I think people just pull out of their ears. And it's frustrating to me when people have dates for this because all we can do is talk about approximate moments when things started. Usually the dates refer to the first really big recorded gallery showing of something that was identified as starting off a specific movement. You guys remember what the difference between periods and movements is? What is an art period as opposed to an art movement?
Well, an art period would be like the actual time that it happens, so like ancient Egyptian art versus like Mesoamerican art, like the actual time period, but then the movement can happen within those time periods and they're more intentional, like people are trying to make a statement with what they're doing rather than just a broad category of the time period.
Yeah, I think that is a really beautiful, concise description of it, where the art period is reflective of the culture as a whole, and the art movement is a reflection of what the artists are trying to talk about within that culture. So yeah, beautiful, excellent. And Post-Impressionism is people dealing with just the structures that were developed and the way of looking at the world through Impressionism. And since we're going to be talking about Fauvism and Expressionism, I think that this video would be a good one to watch. It's only a couple minutes long, and if it gets really boring, we can stop. You know. So let's. Oh, I love technology. It helps so much. Okay, here we go.
By 1886, most critics and the public had accepted Impressionism. It was no longer an outsider movement. In fact, it really became the movement for most artists to get involved with. However, some young artists thought that Impressionists were neglecting too many of the traditional elements of painting. And by this, I mean they aren't really creating finished paintings. Rather, they're creating studies. They're not really the concrete museum pieces that we see today. Now, by the 1880s, some artists were using a more systematic approach in their exploration of light and color, which is still going to be key to a lot of the post-impressionist work. So what is post-impressionism? Really, we're looking at the work or style of a varied group of artists, including Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat, and Cézanne. And they're reacting against the naturalism of the Impressionists to explore the emotional response of the artist. Basically, we're looking at the artist's response to the image that they're looking at, their emotional response depicted on the canvas. And why are they called post-impressionists? Because all of these artists, Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat, and Cézanne, start as impressionists and then go in 4 different routes, pursuing their own goals, all looking at emotion on the canvas, all really becoming self-expressive artists, but they're doing it in their own particular and peculiar at times ways. By 1880,
Sorry about that. So this, I think, was a really good. It's a short video, but it touches on that idea that when we're talking about movements, a post movement does not necessarily mean that it only comes after. That's not what it's just limited to. What it's referring to is actually how the artists are reacting to the previous movement. So, like in that, he's talking about Seurat and Gauguin. What he's describing is that they are responding and reacting to what Impressionism allowed to happen by making their own thing. And by the time we get to the 20th century, they have established and built pretty successful styles of their own work. And the Expressionism, we see a really heavy emotional weight added to the paintings because the artist, with Impressionism, artists give themselves the freedom or take the freedom to paint what they are seeing. They're no longer like up to even through the Baroque, the realist and romantics of the early 19th century and into the Hudson River School of the Americas at about the same time. People are still producing work that they expect their audience to relate to. And the Impressionists are trying to stay away from that by showing what they're seeing, what they reflect on what they're seeing. And artists, the reality is artists never make what they see. They always make what they're thinking about what they see. And there are conscious choices that realist artists do to make that, to change their perceptions and, or the relation of their perceptions so that other people can relate to it as well. And that's how you get the realist art. But with the post-impressionists, instead of just relating what they're seeing, they're also relating what they're feeling about what they're seeing, and you get and that's what I think you get a lot more emotional content with the post-impressionists. We look at Van Gogh, for example. It's really difficult to see anything but energy in the paintings that he's producing between 1890 and when he dies. It's almost his emotions are spilling onto the canvas, and the paint is just there to kind of rein it in a little bit, because he's doing that. Edvard Munch is another really good example of what that led into, because his stuff is almost entirely emotion. You still have this thread that connects what the artists produce to a shareable vocabulary. You still recognize places, you still recognize people, and things like that, and that's a very important element of those paintings. But I think the artists are becoming more and more self-referential. They're giving themselves the permission to, or well, I don't know if they're giving themselves permission, but they're laying claim to the capacity to share what they're truly feeling, and it's less of a shared visual vocabulary. And I think you can see that we're moving away from things that have a very easily relatable attachment to our shared environment. And you do see that right at the turn of the century with what Van Gogh is doing with like the Night Cafe, for example. A lot of people say that is really spooky because you can see somebody on the other side of a billiards table, but their legs don't go all the way to the floor. Things are a little bit disjointed and stuff. and he's painting his, even though it's post-impressionism, he's still painting his emotional impressions of the environment that he's in, rather than trying to share with people what he's seeing so that they can lay hold on it. And I wanted to share this with you. And this leads us into something that, when it was first being shown in galleries, people were nauseated. There are examples of, there's stories about women throwing up when they went to the galleries. And there are examples of people passing out. And when these finished paintings were showing up, the artists felt that they were complete works, but the art critics at the time said it looks like wild beasts painted them. And that's where it gets the term, Fauvism. It means beastly, or like a beast would paint it. Now, this is an example of several different artists working with this idea of Fauvism. What are some of the things that you can see that are consistent with all these paintings? It's obvious that different artists did them, but if we look at even what Van Gogh was doing, if we look at typical Impressionist paintings, even if we look at Pointillism, what is distinctly different about these?
Bright colors.
Incredibly bright colors, yeah. Like, look at this guy's
Really,
face.
yeah. I'd say like really, really bold lines as well. Like there's a lot of outline or black outlining on things, really bold lines.
Yeah, yeah. You see that particularly like with what Cezanne was doing. Very strong outlines. You see a lot of outlines here. Sometimes the outlines are painted on, like here, and sometimes the outlines come because a field of color is laid over a darker shape, like in some of these areas. You have an outline here for that reason. What are some of the other things that's going on? One of the things that I see is shapes. The shapes appear to me to be laid down really quickly, and laid down where the primary motive is to share energy, as opposed to give you a realistically approachable or shareable vocabulary. Like particularly this one, we can tell that there are things here. It's called a still life, so it's a good idea. This is probably an aubergine. This is probably a bottle. This is maybe an apple. But we know that only because contextually that makes sense if this is a still life. The shapes they're not quite entirely arbitrary, but more attention is given to those fields of bright color like Van was talking about, rather than the concrete sharing of ideas through easily identifiable shapes. The trees in this by Matisse, they feel to me to be more like expressions of ideas of a trunk of branches and leaves, as opposed to a really approachable symbol of a tree, a really easily shareable. Now this one, arguably the boats are a lot more easy to tell, but the use of bright, brilliant colors on this, it reminds me of, who was the dude who painted like hundreds of portraits of the Notre Dame? Because he wanted to get
Monet.
Monet, yeah. It reminds me more of his use of color, where he was not trying to express the color of the object, he was trying to express the color as the light bounced back towards him, which is a completely different perspective. And I think that these are really fascinating. But you can also see these have a lot of energy to them, and so I get excited when I look at them, because I can feel some of that energy bleeding off into me. But you can really see, particularly in this one, why critics were so upset, and they said, "Oh, it looks like a wild beast painted it," because people are still reeling from it. It's been a full generation since the beginning of Impressionism, but a lot of people are still kind of reeling from that unsettling perspective that was realized through Impressionism, and just the rug, I think, was pulled out from under a lot of people again with the Fauvists. And then we get very quickly into Expressionism, and I think, again, this is one of those examples where an art movement is expressed almost arbitrarily, because in my mind, I look at Expressionism and it feels to me as if the artists are using the freedom that was gained from Impressionism, expanding it with the vocabulary that was developed through Fauvism, and kind of overlap the two. But I want to share this video with you. Let's see if we can, but I have to press the right buttons first. Okay.
Expressionism is a style of art that started around 1912. And here's one of the most famous pieces of that style called The Scream by Edvard Munch. Expressionists were most interested in expressing emotions, and they would do this by manipulating the art elements. Our art elements are like line, shape, color, form, texture, and almost all of those have been changed in this particular image. The colors in the sky give us this feeling of anxiety. The screaming face also has an unpleasant sort of feeling. The artist was expressing his feelings in Europe before the pending wars. So we get that feeling through the work that he's done and by the way he's manipulated the art elements within the work. But there's always going to be a subject. How about this one? Can you see a subject? Well, it's called Woman with a Bicycle by de Kooning, and it's very hard to see somebody in there, but they're there. So sometimes you need to ask a few questions before you jump to a conclusion. In the center, there's an abstracted sort of woman shape, and then the bicycle might be a little harder to find. Why would he do this? Well, he was trying to express something either about the person and what he felt about them, or how he felt that her personality might best be represented. This painting is called Portrait of Pope Innocent X, and it's sometimes called The Screaming Pope by Francis Bacon. It's a nightmare. We've got these screechy colors coming down the front of the face screaming. It's very unpleasant. This isn't something you'd want to have in your living room, perhaps, but it is expressing emotion, and that's the key thing to the Expressionist movement of art. There's always
Yeah, I think that Pope Innocent X painting is really awful, but the Edvard Munch painting is from 1912. The others are a little bit more recent, but I think that it gives a pretty good awareness of, or pretty good examples of how Expressionism differs from even Post-Impressionism. And I don't know, I really like some of the paintings because of the freedom of expression that the artist used, but this is a time period as well, that early 20th century, where people are using the painting to really express that the whole entire unsettling perspective that they have on the world rapidly changing. You know, it still keeps changing faster and faster and faster. Now you get the Steel movements. Pete Mondrian, who responded by really simplifying everything. That's the guy who did the white canvas with the horizontal and vertical black lines. But it's you also, on the other hand, you get that really kind of scary emotional expressionism that was shown with Edvard Munch and Francis Bacon. I really find the Francis Bacon paintings less than palatable, but I really appreciate the fact of the expression. You know, Willem de Kooning, the same kind of thing. It feels to me very disturbing and unsettling, but it's fascinating to me too that, and it recalls to mind, Aristotle said that if you find yourself at the extreme of expression, you need for a while to reset yourself by going to the opposite extreme. And then taking a stick that has been bent one way, you soften it up with steam, and then you bend it the other way, and after time you can let go, and it comes back and finds a medium. And I think that that's what Expressionism functions as, where a lot of artists were going really far in expressing personal emotion and strong emotion, and then after that it allowed for a resettling where people could be more honest with their own feelings. And you know, and we look at that in just today with the pop industry, you get the occasional artist that goes way over the top on everything. And when they kind of settle down and the Führer dies, then everybody else, they can step up and do their music a little bit more honestly. They're not going out of their way to offend anybody, but it's allowed for a little bit more openness and freedom in their own personal expression. And that's kind of the take that I have regarding expressionism, because I find it really, really difficult to deal with sometimes. It's important, but it's one of those things like I talked about where the validity of the art has little to do with the art itself. Well, no, it does relate to the art itself, but the expressive beauty of the art, I guess, is something that in this example has to grow from my own personal maturity and growth before I can really appreciate things. But honestly, I don't know if I could ever find the Screaming Pope lovely. I just, that's just, anyway.
Say, have you heard what Neil deGrasse Tyson says about art?
What did he say about it?
I'll slaughter this, but he says that if it reflects our worldview, then it's entertainment, and if it challenges our worldview, then it's art.
I like that. I think that's really good. I think art up until the Industrial Revolution has always been something to expand and beautify an environment. You know, like putting oxygen in a room, that was the function that art served. It wasn't just to look at and be pretty. It was something that actually was intended to make the environment more livable. And like we talked about a little bit last week, art had started becoming a commodity through the period of the Industrial Revolution, until now it's almost an afterthought, and it's a decoration, and it's an unnecessary decoration a lot of the time. But I really love that. If it's something that reflects your worldview, it's entertainment. It's like the self-confirming bias that you get through social media. And if it challenges it, it's like education, and it's something that expands and improves the environment. I think that's really valid. I like that. Here's something else where of course, my brain is like a pachinko machine, but what is interesting to me about these different movements that we're looking at is one is supposed to happen after the other, and it's supposed to very conveniently be placed in a progression as we get closer to contemporary time. And that's not the case. Many of these artists began as Impressionists. Then as they got older, they responded to the ideas of Impressionism by becoming Post-Impressionists. And then if they lived long enough, they started experimenting with Fauvism. And then some of them, after Fauvism, found Expressionism. And I don't think that these artists ever woke up and said, you know, it's Tuesday now, I'm going to become a Fauvist. I don't think they ever did that. I think it's more of an expression of the world, their response to the world changing around them. And it's fascinating to me, you know, looking at art in places that, for example, war did break out. Like, for example, in Europe, in Prussia, for example, and Eastern Europe. As we get closer to the beginning of World War I, it seems that the art becomes almost more frantic. And I think it's because people are responding to the cultural stress, where everybody kind of feels they're getting close to a war. Everybody's kind of getting scared. And I think that's really fascinating to me, how it seems to go along with that. And you can see that also with the Dadaists that we talk about in a couple of weeks. Hannah Hoch and Marcel Duchamp were demonstrating against the gallery system and the expectations placed upon artists as commodity builders, you know, creators. But they were also responding to the feeling of coming into preparing into World War II. And I was listening to somebody just a couple of days ago who said World War II had its start at the Treaty of Versailles, because the Germans were treated so poorly. The only way they could respond is with a rebuilding of nationalism, you know, retrenchment of morality that led directly into Nazism, which I thought was funny, because Nazism, not funny, haha, but, you know, funny as in more ironic. Nazism was a direct outgrowth of a religious retrenchment where people wanted to become almost violently conservative in their Christianity. And then it became incredibly anti-Christian with the Nazism. But it's fascinating to me to see how these kind of things come together and seem to reflect how we imagine people would feel as their societies were preparing for industrialized violence. I just think that that's really interesting. Of course, if we were alive at the time, we would not be using terms like, yes, that's interesting, you know. But I wanted to, this same guy that we just saw also talks about Fauvism. And I realized I should have shown that before the Expressionism, but a lot of these things are kind of mixed together.
Fauvism is a style of art that started around 1910. And here we see a masterpiece in that style called Cat with a Red Fish by Henry Matisse. When you look at it and try and discover what school of art it might be from, you might be fooled into thinking it's Impressionism. We see that.
So what are the things about this? Like when we saw the paintings at the Met, on that Met website of, like a half a dozen different Fauvist artists, what are the things that we can pick out that kind of place this in a Fauvist style?
It's got the bright colors and the dark outlines.
Yeah. Excellent. What else?
Bold shapes.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's really good. Those three things, the bright colors, the outlines, and the bold shapes, are things that really help us easily identify Fauvism. And what is fascinating to me is it wasn't really used widespread until the 1930s. Advertisers had been aware of it since about 1810, but this idea of how color impacts emotion that was heavily used throughout the 30s as countries like Russia and Germany and the U.S. were trying to use color and visual imagery to control people. This is where we get the science of propaganda. Mao Zedong said that the artist's role is to create propaganda. That was the only valid art. And we look at, there's very distinctive styles, but very distinctive color use during that time. And when we look at the Fauvism, and then this bleeding into Expressionism, it's apparent to me that artists are beginning to experiment with the emotions, either implied through color use, or expressed with color use, or controlled with color use. We get this kind of this yellow cat. I have seen cats that are kind of orange, but this particular yellow with the blue there, it can feel really unsettling. Well, it's on the leg, I guess it's green, but it almost feels like this could potentially be read as a reflection of the blue from the table, even. And then the water, I mean, I would never want to put a fish or leave a fish in water that color. Last time a fish bowl that my kids had with water that had water that color, all the fish died. But we see this. We can assume that this might be flowers, just because it's a jumble of really bright, strong colors that, by scale, seem to be something akin to flower blossoms. And we can kind of see that reflected in the window here. With maybe these are flowers as well. And the trees. This is a very pointillist expression of a tree. So he's drawing from his pointillist background too. But I just think it's really fascinating to me how, as we come closer to today, it seems that artists are granting themselves permission more and more to use color as an additional set of vocabulary, or additional vocabulary set to impact and manipulate emotion in the viewers, not just communicate it. And I say that about propaganda because I think that their awareness really led directly to the use of propaganda, coloring propaganda. I don't know, your parents probably had memories of going to schools in the late 40s, throughout the 50s, early 60s, And the colors that were being used in schools at that time were specifically engineered in the US to keep children calm. This is where we get a lot of that really horrible aqua, a lot of that really terrible kind of pasty green and the browns. Um, the retro waffle makers and the retro toasters you can get at Walmart now. There's a particularly bright red, but there's also aqua and blue. And those colors were specifically engineered around 1937 to 1939 as an environmentally calming color, which blows me away. I always assumed those kinds of colors people did to make you feel sick, but apparently that was not the case.
I just wanted to add something before we move on from Fauvism. Something I've noticed, because you're talking about how like the artwork is kind of unsettling. I think something that adds to that is the way that they address the sense of space and depth. Because unlike Impressionism, where there still is that feeling of depth and, there's a lot of, I don't know, like it feels like you can go in it. With Fauvism, they do have a lot of flat colors, and I've noticed in Matisse's work, especially when he has the like paintings of an interior of a home, it's almost like an illusion sometimes, where something's in the background, but that continues and goes in front of stuff, and it's just kind of weird and messes with your head and kind of adds to that uncomfortable feeling that they have. I think
there's a lot to that. I think that's a really, really strong observation. We look at those. Let's go back to those Met paintings, because I think you can really see that. Let's see. I like particularly this one by Henri Matisse. It is very flat. I mean, it feels like this back panel should be a wall. The floor should come up. There should be a joint right there where the wall goes from being horizontal, going away from us. I mean, the floor goes away from us to the vertical presence of the wall, but instead it opens up and you have the dancers in the background. And you look at these other ones, like the sailor, the only reason we can really sense that he's sitting on a chair is because that's the kind of place, that's the kind of assumption we make when we see these objects. We assume that it's a chair. There's no real visual cues about depth, like what Aspen was saying. I think that's a really strong observation. Same thing with the still life. Same kind of thing. And then we look at the fishing boats, and I think this is a little bit of a change, but we can only sense depth because of the expansion of blue in these sails, and we assume that they're placed. It's not all the same structure that we assume that they're placed one in front of another, and it's only by the expansion of blue that we get any sort of a sense of depth. And still, it feels like that's an arbitrary observation, as opposed to that's really part of the construction of the painting. So I think that's a really strong, excellent observation.
Yeah, the one that comes to my mind when I think of that is the one he did of his studio. Like the entire thing is just one flat color, and the only thing that gives you the sense that maybe it's a three-dimensional room is that some of the paintings are at an angle. So I think it's interesting.
Yeah, but even then, the depth seems to keep becoming more from the artist assuming that we're going to assume that, that the actual shape is intended to be a rectangle, and the depth comes because the rectangle shape is being shown as a diamond. And I think that observation is really valid. And I look at like paintings that Gauguin did when he was in Tahiti. Same kind of thing. I mean, you get really strong plant forms, you get really strong human forms, but the depth comes because we assume that these shapes are in front of each other, and that's how they're impacting each other. So we assume the depth of field because of our own presuppositions about form and shape. And I think that's very, very true. I wanted to show the videos here are we're going to not we're not going to watch them with sound. I like them because they're really short videos for one thing, but they also show several different paintings. And so we have the painters. This is, we're moving from the Romanticism into Impressionism. And we're starting to feel like with the texture of the trees, with the texture of the background, this feels very much impressionistic. Well, this feels very romantic. Which, and of course, I'm talking about the painting style. It seems like this is just another day at work for her, and it seems like these guys are just visiting. These people seem very disconnected, but I think that this is a good example of that idea of coming into early Impressionism. This I think is really fascinating. I think this is where we start seeing an artist being aware of the potential of expression through it feels to me like there's a definite impact and awareness of photography in this. And the reason I say that is because there you get this kind of bleed over of shadow and form that you get in either deteriorating photography or poorly developed photography of the time. And it feels to me like this is almost an awareness of that idea of how the eye sees too. I don't know if anybody wants to agree with me or not. That's fine. I don't really care. But
Do you know the year of this painting?
Yeah, 1872. So we're
Okay.
talking, oh, what was colloidal gel? So this is right after colloidal gel is starting to be used. So people were starting to make prints on paper, and you could do reproduce prints on paper.
Yes, you just had photos were basically not considered art. They were meant to be, documents, like Civil War photography, right? But then Stieglitz was doing pictorialism, which was, fighting to get it considered as an art. And he was doing a lot of like weird, like gum prints and stuff that sort of like put heavy pigment over the top of it, which does feel similar, except for obviously it looks more real.
Well, he was experimenting with burning. He was experimenting. What's that little thing where you have a shape on a stick and you kind of shake it, so that you could burn some of the images.
Oh yeah,
Parts of it should be
dodging and burning. Yeah.
Yeah, dodging and burning. Yeah, playing with those kinds of ideas. And I think that personally, and I hope I don't offend anybody, I think the argument against photography as an art medium is just stupid. And the reason I think that is, at the very least, it's just like any other medium. Somebody has to be there to decide what to take a picture of. And the person doing that cannot help but evaluate, at least subconsciously, what's going to be valuable as an image.
Yeah.
And so to remove
the counterpoint is there's a lot of really bad photography.
Oh yeah, that's true. Like Prince said, if you have a broad use of a medium, you're going to have a lot of bad art. But to just categorically say that photography cannot be art, I just think misses the entire awareness of the relationship of the human being and the tool. So I hope I didn't hurt anybody's feelings by saying that. And if I did, let me know and I'll try to edit it out of the video. But this is from the same kind of time period, and we still get a very strong sense, I think, of that impressionist feel. And you'll look at there were some Australian photographers at the same time that Stieglitz was doing his thing that were really experimenting with layered exposure times and processing with different media in between the light source and the paper. Or I'm sorry, not the light source, but the negative and the paper. And they were getting some really fascinating effects. Like this is where it wasn't until later that people started to develop the images after freezing, with water on the negative, but you get some really amazing effects that I think are really have really strong parallels to what was going on with the Impressionist painters as well, even though that photography that I'm talking about came 20, 25 years later. But it's fascinating to me to see what these people are doing with Impressionism. And still, we're very, very strongly centered in the 19th century. But I think you can see with these images, they're still, the artists, even though they're expressing themselves, are still anchoring everything in a relatable environment, specifically relatable to their audience. Let's see, I'm get to something else here. Now, even when somebody sets up a trail cam to document what the deer are feeding, it still takes the human being deciding where to set up the trail cam and how often to take the photos. So anyway, of course, nobody knows what my opinion is. Let's see, give me just a second here. This leads us into Post-Impressionism. So we're dealing with stuff that's after that, and after what we saw. And this is where we get this feeling of lack of depth of field, where in this image, the only reason we can really identify a depth is because of the relative size of the players. We'll make the assumption that these are human sized individuals, and we know that they're farther away because the artist is depending on us making that assumption. You look at just as with that thing that Aspen shared, all the background is the same flat shade. Right? This is another example of the same kind of thing. We only know that there's a depth because we assume that these are in front because they are overlapping. We assume that these people are in the middle ground because we're making the assumption that they are the same size in real life that these people are. And we're assuming that this is a child because they kind of have those proportions. But again, the background is all the same flat color. Now, of course, this painting was done after Van Gogh came forward 100 years with Doctor Who. And you can tell, the influence that post-TARDIS had on his view of the night sky. I hope people understand I'm not being serious when I say stuff like that. This, I think, is a really good example. This was done right around 1890. And this feels to me like it's Mary Cassatt, but it's interesting to me because we have the kind of exploration of mark making and color use that was indicative of the Impressionists. But it feels to me like there's other things going on that pushes this a little bit closer to us cognitively. And she is considered an Impressionist and Post-Impressionist. So that makes sense, but I think you could probably make the argument that this is one or either one. And with that kind of bold use of color, I think Mary Cassatt really presaged the Fauvists too. Oh, this is really good. This makes me think of Gauguin's work, in Tahiti, with that kind of approaching Fauvism from the early part of it, and I see this as kind of one of those bridge works between Impressionism and later Fauvism. You get a really unnatural, emotional use of color, but you still have that kind of imaginative mark making too, that the Impressionists are known for. I think I think there's a lot of presaging of the Fauvism on this too. I think that this is kind of fascinating. This reminds me of, oh, what's his name? Klimt, Gustav Klimt. This reminds me of some of the stuff that he did where he was playing with pattern and almost trying to give people motion sickness when they looked at his paintings.
Is he the one that painted like KKK figures?
He's famous for the Kiss.
Mm.
Gustav Klimt is, and let's see if I can find. Give me just a second here. Let me see if I can find one of his paintings or some of his paintings. So, you know, he played with a lot of pattern, and I think we could make the argument that he was a Fauvist as well, because of those same things that Aspen was pointing out and what Van was talking about. I think we could make an argument like that. You know, we look at the Kiss, and the depth of field of this only comes because of our assumptions as a viewer. It doesn't seem to have a lot of clues, or the artist doesn't provide an awful lot of clues visually as to what things are in front of each other than what the assumptions we make. It's very, very flat background. This is the foreground reminds me of the Pointillism by Seurat. You know, that kind of post-impressionist view of, well, it was kind of a fusion between self-referential point of view with an awareness of optics, you know, and so you get these points coming together. And I think it was also had to do with early print technology too. But I don't know, I think this is fascinating. And it's interesting that it does fit in that same time period really, really soundly. Oh, and I lost where I was. Oh, yeah, here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. I get sidetracked and I think of things that, but here we see that the outlining starting to show up, you know, on some of these fruits, and that's a really powerful indicator of Fauvism. And this is just, I think this is presaging it quite a bit. This, I think, is really a fascinating one because the sister of the artist almost seems to be getting sucked into the wall. And rather than depending on outlines like the Fauvist did, and a lot of that stuff by Cezanne we saw, it almost seems like he's trying to pull away from making any sort of separation between the figure and background and all those other kinds of things. So I think this is really interesting. And this is another fascinating one where it's because of the mark making and, you know, the shapes and the trees and stuff, it still feels like there's a lot of that impressionist kind of perspective, but we get this kind of playfulness with shapes and forms that presages again the Fauvist kind of thing. But I can imagine if you're somebody who's wealthy and sunk a lot of your money into the realist and romantic stuff, this kind of thing would really kind of piss you off a little. And like my grandpa said, this just looked like somebody smearing stuff on a canvas, which essentially is what it is. But this, I think, really squarely lines up everything to come towards Fauvism. And then we get to this. It almost seems to me like the Post-Impressionism is just a term given to that bridge between Impressionism and Fauvism almost. I mean, you can really see a transition of the perspective of the artist. And I think that this, when we get to this, about 1905, artists are finally brave enough to give themselves permission to do this sort of thing. Okay, I'm trying to get to some specific paintings to see this. I'm sorry that this is a little bit out of focus. But what's fascinating to me is we get these fields of color. It's a really strong color. We get the shapes are not very tightly constructed. We do have the outlines, you know, for the buildings and stuff like that to kind of differentiate the shapes. But the forms of the buildings almost feel like they're an expression of architecture rather than trying to relate any really solid or concrete form. And I think I can totally see how somebody would say that this is done by a wild beast. Now this, when I saw one or watched this video on a much smaller scale, these things felt like they were a lot more in focus. So I'm sorry about that, but it is. I don't necessarily know if we have to have everything in focus to really kind of appreciate what's going on with Fauvism. But again, we see that kind of lack of depth of field. We see the outlines. We see the very flat shapes and the really bold use of color. I think this is really kind of interesting, and it does seem cognitively to be preparing people for the kind of self-referenced permission that artists needed to really develop the more abstract styles that are indicative of the early 20th century. What do you guys think?
Honestly, I'd never really considered how all this relates to the Industrial Revolution and how fast everything was changing. Because I mean, if you think before this, like the art movements weren't that different from each other. You know, there were small, subtle changes that happened really slowly over long periods of time, and you know, they reflected reality more. And so I think it's really interesting to think, just, you know, to see how this just sort of captures the chaos and like just how crazy it must have felt to see all of these things start to happen, you know, where you know, again, change is happening so fast to us. It's still continuing to happen, but it's but now we're sort of like numb to it. We're checking out because of it. And I can't imagine what it would have been like to be there when it was starting, you know.
Well, yeah, and if you consider the human form in Gothic art, you know, right post Crusades, is very elongated. You know, when a human form is displayed in a church, it's very elongated. It looks like it's floating. It looks angelic, and the realism is only in the face, the forms of the face, not in the expression or anything. And then it took 200 years after that to get to the point where artists were drawing things that were anatomically expressive, and you could see all the muscles, and you know, and you could see things that were relatable to you from a very physical standpoint. And then it took another couple hundred years to get to the point where, oh, the Dutch guy, oh, what's his name? I'm talking like late Baroque, where people are using the expressiveness of the oil strokes to imply energy, and they're laying that on top of a very anatomically, academically expressed human form. You know, and that took another 200 years, and then like what Joey's talking about, these art periods, this is just spanning a single lifetime. And you know, when right at this time, the average cause of death in Europe and the U.S. was diarrhea. The cityscape in the ancient Harappan culture of 4,000 years ago was safer from exposure to bacteria and sewage than it was in London at this time. You know, and but just it's astounding to me how the art seems to really be reflecting the rapidly changing perspective and almost the feeling of lack of control that people have as the world is shifting around them. And I think what Joey says is absolutely right. We almost take it for granted how quickly things change today. You know, I purposely will irritate my kids when I ask them to take a selfie of me, because I know, you know, that's not how it works. But it's funny to me how I have to read a manual and learn how to do something, but my kids can pick it up and they figure it out in a moment. And it's not because, well, I hope it's not because they're dramatically more intelligent than me. It's just because the expectations they put on themselves are dramatically different than the expectations that all of us grew up with. You know, and that is constantly true. You know, Aspen, as you relate to 10 and 12-year-olds, you feel the same way. There is that disconnect between your relationship with technology and their relationship with technology. You know, and that's, but I think this art really encapsulates that entire perspective. But I recommend going through those videos, looking at the different artwork that's related in it. You know, go to the Met thing and check out those. I think there's like 7 or 8 paintings there, and just try to diagram mentally what's going on with this. But I think that the Post-Impressionists, the Fauvists, and the Expressionists are the first real European art movements identified with painting of that early 20th century. And I think that Art Deco and Prairie style are the first real architectural statements of the early 20th century. And admittedly, I didn't touch on those really strongly. We just looked at the paintings. That's easier to handle, I think, and point at. But if you guys would like to, we can look at stronger examples of architecture. I think the 20th century has come up with some really interesting takes on architecture. There were several, believe it or not, there were several experimental architects who lived in Utah and produced buildings from about 1910 to about 1960. And, you know, we see that the typical Utah building that we envision comes from that very strong kind of neo-Puritan perspective that surrounded the Prohibition. You know, we get this kind of almost nauseatingly bland Baroque approach to 19th century civil architecture in these structures that have the very strong Art Deco lettering, but the very almost brutalist brickwork. You know, and we can examine that in a little bit more detail, but I think even that in Utah is very indicative of the desire to be with the in crowd of prohibitionists. You know, and I think it's an expression of I think architecture at that time is more of an expression of how people relate to government than giving people permission to express themselves architecturally. And you know, and that's we'll get into that a little bit more as we move on. But it's fascinating to me how we can, if we want to contextualize what's going on in the world economically and societally, I think that we can really see that reflected in the different art styles that the artists are using, whether or not those art styles are popular. A really good example of that is just the Soviet surrealist photography in the 1940s and the brutalist architecture. You know, they're really trying to run screaming away from anything that has any relationship to spirituality. And it shows in the art and it shows in the architecture. And it makes me feel hopeless looking at stuff from that time. In the early 90s, I met a gentleman who, so this is just, 5 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And my mom was there months after the Berlin Wall came down, and I still have in my collection an empty bottle of the air that she collected from where the Berlin Wall used to be. That's the kind of family I have. But in the early 90s, the gentleman that I met was a Soviet artist. He was the guy, do you guys know about the stamps that the Soviets did for the Olympics that the US boycotted? I'll try to find a picture of it, but it's very neo-Fauvist, very flat. the energy comes from the strokes of color used. This guy was the one who painted those paintings, or those stamps. He's the one who designed it. Talking to him, you find out that an artist in the Soviet era, he did stained glass, he did decorative brickwork, he did everything, because they would say, okay, you're labeled as an artist now. This is where you're going to work and you're going to do this. And so he described inventing the tools he needed to create the leading and to use to cut the glass to make the stained glass windows that he was assigned to develop. Teaching himself how to do the painting in the style that the government wanted for those stamps. You know, that was the kind of world that he lived in. And it's very much different from how we want to think that artists are. You know, I don't know, that's just fascinating. We'll be touching on that stuff later on in the semester, but I just thought it was really fascinating. Any questions or observations before we separate? Everybody happy? Okay, good. Excellent. So you'll notice that I extended the first project deadline by a week, and I pushed everything back a week just because I wanted everybody to have time to go through those brainstorm ideas. And all the ideas I thought were remarkable. I think they're great. And some of them have to be tweaked to fit within the confines of our class for this semester. But as long as you can document, like Brittany did a really good job. She did a prehistory art project for our 2710 class. And the way she shared it was in a PowerPoint, talking about the kind of art that she was looking at, where it was placed, and then some of the articles that she had read about it. And it was a really excellent presentation. And that's, so I think that you guys, from the proposals that you've already kind of presented, and from what Brittany did, I think you guys have a pretty clear idea of what we're doing for those projects. But please, stop by my office when I'm there, email me, whatever you need to, but talk to me before you work on the project if you have any doubt in your mind. And again, I want to really stress the idea that if you don't get perfect points, you can always make the changes necessary and then resubmit, to get those points. The only reason people have not gotten perfect scores in the classes that I've taught, is because either they don't do the work or they don't resubmit and don't make the changes. So, something to think about. But that's all I really have to say that has anything to do with the class. Other than that, I hope you guys have a wonderful week and nobody gets food poisoning. Food poisoning sucks. I'm
That
sure.
sounds terrible.
Yeah, thankfully that hasn't happened to me, but I don't want it to happen to you guys either. At least not in the last, 3 months. But I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will look forward to talking to you Wednesday, if not before.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see you guys later.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.